Hello and welcome back. In this video we're going to start writing the code we need to build our infrastructure for GloboCycle, and we're going to start right here on line 10 with our resource group. So we talked about our resource group a little bit in the last video. Now every resource in Azure does need a resource group. Doesn't matter what you're doing, what you're building, everything has to be part of a resource group. So we're going to leave line 10 pretty much as it is. We're just going to provide it some arguments to give it a proper name. So in Pulumi, every single resource is built in exactly the same way. The syntax remains the same between resources. The only thing that's different is what you're providing it. So everything will start with the word new. So we're creating a new object, the type of the resource, then the name of the resource for Pulumi, and then it will take in some arguments. So in this case, it takes in some resource group args, which is again a new object. And it takes a resource group name. So we're just going to call as RSG GloboCycle. Now, if you're working for a company, you will have your own naming conventions. Please make sure you understand them. Don't get in trouble because of me. Make sure that you're following your company's guidelines on naming. Okay, with that, that's our resource group done. And we can move on to a virtual network. Now, we're going to clean this up a little bit. We're just going to get rid of everything from line 15 downwards. We'll just highlight all of that and delete it. And we're also going to delete all of our libraries at the top. The only library we're going to use is this one. So we're going to use Azure Native equals Pulumi.Azure Native. Now, this may look a little bit strange because we're doing something slightly different. The reason we're doing this is because this is how the documentation does it. I want to make sure that as a beginner, you can go to the documentation and everything that you've seen in these videos will match what's in the documentation. This is a style choice. You can do this in different ways, but for now, while you're getting comfortable, let's just follow what they do in the documentation. Now we do have to quickly change this as well. So this now becomes Azure Native.resources.resource group, and this becomes Azure Native.resources.resource group args. Okay, and with that we can now start creating our virtual network. So exactly the same as the resource group, we're going to say var virtual network equals new Azure Native.network.virtual network, and we're going to call it virtual network. And this one takes in arguments, and it's just Azure Native.network.virtual network args, and that's an object, and we'll close it off with a semicolon. It takes a name just like the resource group did, and we're just going to call it vnet-globocycle. Now this is where it starts getting slightly different. So a virtual network, as you probably know in Azure, is just like a real life network. It has an address space, and everything that connects to it has to be part of that address space. So they all take an IP address, but it has to be an IP address that belongs to the network. So with that said, we can create an address space. An address space is an object, but it's going to look slightly different to this. So if you use the IntelliSense, this is what it will give you. It will give you Pulumi.input and then a generic argument, Azure Native network input address args, address space args. We don't want that. It's a bit too verbose, and that's again not how the documentation does it. So what we're going to do is take off this more than sign at the end, and the less than sign and the Pulumi.input off the front, and we're just going to keep this here. And it is an object, so we'll open up the object, and inside address space it takes address prefixes. Again, using IntelliSense to help us a little bit there. Address prefixes is a new list of strings, and it will be our address space. So in our case, we're just going to use the biggest network for now, and we're just going to do 10.0.0.0/16. And you may have noticed that did automatically re-add system.collections.generic to the top of my file. If it didn't do that for you, just add it at the top now. Okay, so that's our virtual network. And with that, I think it's time that we looked at the documentation, because you're probably wondering, well, how do we know where these objects are coming from? How do we know what to name our resources? How do we know where the arguments are? How do we know what's there? So in the next video, we're going to have a quick look at the documentation, and then we'll come back and we'll start building some more resources. So I'll see you there.